COVID-19's impact on Latino workers panel. My name is Brianna Communel, and I'm a UCLA law student. It is my pleasure to introduce Patricia Campos Medina, who will guide us through a very rich discussion with our distinguished speakers.
Thank you, everyone. Wasn't this morning so phenomenal to be in that room and listen to the purpose of being here? It's exciting. My name is Patricia Campos Medina, Dr. Patricia Campos Medina. I lead the Workers Institute at the School of Industrial Labor Relations as a labor research center and training at the School of Industrial Labor Relations. Okay. Más fuerte. Ok, me puedo poner más cerca. I am also a long-time labor activist and union organizer, so I come to academia looking how to empower and advance research and policy that addresses key concerns of workers in the current economy. So the issue of the women and the recovery during the COVID-19 is at the center of how we're going to move forward a more resilient economy in the United States. It's an exciting panel. And I always start panels about Latinos by remembering everybody that we are, every economic issue in this country is a Latino issue, is a Latina issue, because when people ask you, well, is this a Latino issue? And I was like, it is a Latino issue because we are Americans, right? We are here, we're part of what makes this economy thrive. So we all experienced the pandemic, and we all have a lot of traumatic memories of what happened. But I always said that I was we who are professionals had experiences in a different way, right? We were home, we were trying to keep our professional lives and our families functioning, but there was a whole lot of workers that were outside working, that were keeping the economy going. And we can't forget about the impact that it had on low-wage workers, on immigrant workers, on undocumented workers, and on women. One of the things that I never forget, and I want to repeat it over and over again, because as we have this conversation, we have to remember this, that the highest casualty of COVID pandemic deaths were Latino men. And because they were essential workers, they were out there working. And that left a whole generation of Latino children and Latina women as single moms. And as we look at the data, and it says that we have a high level of single-headed households led by Latina, and that we see in that trend, let's remember the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic had on our families, and specifically on Latino men. That was part of the legacy. So the COVID-19 pandemic, we're going to have a great panel to help us have a discussion about where are Latinas and what's happening to Latinas after the pandemic. And before I'll describe the purpose of the panel, and then I introduce the panelists, and I have some questions that they will answer for us. In this panel, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on the Latino workforce. And many people say that, oh my God, we had a pandemic and it revealed all these inequalities in our economy. The problem is that our communities were living that economic inequality for a long time before it happened. In the past 3 years, pandemic-related public health crisis and economic shocks have widened the impact even bigger. And as we pivot our focus to the future of our economy, the strength of its economic recovery will be measured not just by how well Latina workers bounce back, but also how resilient they are to build a future, for their children and their families. In this panel, we will uplift novel research highlighting pre-pandemic issues like equal pay and gender discrimination, while lifting new findings about the benefits of unionization, paid leave, expansion, and flexibility in the workplace. Ultimately, in this panel, we'll identify law and policy proposals that will actually enhance the ability of Latinas to bounce back. To help us out this discussion, we have three amazing Latinas who are practitioners and academics. We're going to start with Stacy Villalobos, Director of Racial Economic Justice Program at Legal Aid at Work. And she advises and represents workers fighting race discrimination in employment, sexual harassment, retaliation, and wage theft. The complete bio is in the program. You can read how amazing she is, but I just wanted to give you a sense about the role that she's going to play in this panel. Next, we're going to have Lorena Gonzalez Fletcher, another amazing Latina, the Executive Secretary Treasurer of the California Labor Federation. She is the first woman of color to serve as a chief officer of the California Labor Federation, was elected in 2022, so congratulations. In 2013, Lorena was elected to the California State Assembly, and he has led practical policy solutions aimed at alleviating real issues in workers' people's lives. She led the effort to approve paid sick leave, and the law that requires farm workers to be paid overtime, and the law protecting janitors, women janitors, from sexual harassment, or any, because men do suffer from sexual harassment as well, so great job as a legislator. Our next panelist is Llezlie Green, Professor of Law and Director of the Civil Justice Clinic at Georgetown University. Professor Green is an expert on employment law, on the intersection of workplace exploitation and immigration precarity, critical race theory, and she's a feminist economist, a civil rights and human rights attorney. So awesome, and congratulations. So to start this discussion, I want to put it on perspective because Latinas did retreat from the workforce in high numbers during the pandemic, but since then they have returned to the workplace in big numbers. So what we need to discuss is why we have a high return rate to the workplace, but are we doing any better than before the pandemic? We're going to start with the first question and go to Llezlie Green. The frame, Latinos were the majority of the essential workforce during the pandemic. But the frame of the term essential worker implies a level of treatment and protection that many frontline workers have not received. We were essential, but yet we were not really being protected as essential workers. What are the specific issues that female essential workers are facing, and how are they being addressed, and why should we view this as a Latina issue?
So I very much appreciate the invitation to participate in this important conversation and to be in the presence of such excellence and advocacy, both legal and policy. In the interest of full disclosure, because of how we were introduced, I actually am not Latina, I'm African American. So I just didn't, I wouldn't be very honest about that. But my work certainly has always intersected in looking at the exploitation of Black and brown workers. And so I just recently transitioned to Georgetown Law School. I've been teaching in American for a number of years, where I'm directing a civil justice clinic. That's an access to justice clinic grounded in advocating for workers' rights. And we handle individual cases on behalf of workers who've experienced wage theft, therefore filling the gap in legal services for the representation of low-wage workers. And obviously our clients in Washington, D.C. are largely Latinx and some Black. And so I'm constantly thinking about and engaging and thinking about race and workplace exploitation as it affects both Black and brown communities. And so my comments here are grounded in this work, as well as my scholarship that often applies a critical race theory lens to the workplace exploitation and subordination of Black and brown workers. I appreciate that the beginning of this program started with a grounding in narrative, because there's such incredible power in narratives and their ability to shape law and policy. And so with COVID-19, we saw the introduction of a new term, what we might call a new narrative, that include many of those laboring in low-wage jobs, that of the essential worker, right? So during the height of the pandemic, essential workers provided the services necessary to meet basic societal and human needs, right? We all started to understand the importance. Well, many of us who've been doing the work have long understood the importance, but as a societal narrative, we were starting to have conversations about workers who were often hidden, or workers who often weren't acknowledged. And so we saw the need for this work and the center, and the need for this work to continue even as quarantines were announced, right? So we have quarantines announced, but the mandates exempted agricultural workers, food manufacturer workers, home healthcare aides, the invisible hospital and healthcare workers, restaurant workers, and by the invisible hospital and healthcare workers, I'm talking about the folks who clean, who serve, or who are in all of the service industries. We were certainly very appreciative, and we would see signs that said, thank you to the doctors and nurses, right? But also, the doctors and nurses can't do their jobs if the buildings aren't operating, right? So we're thinking about where are low-wage workers in these spaces. But restaurant workers, food manufacturer workers, grocery workers, and others necessary to provide the basic societal infrastructure needed for those of us who are able to stay home, to be at home and still have access to food and have our basic needs met. And so Black and brown workers filled many of those roles and therefore experienced higher rates of exposure to the virus. The pandemic's impact on the health of Black and brown communities was striking as death rates soared, right? So we have this particularly poignant visualization of the racialization of the essential workforce, right? We're starting to see and hear about how it's impacting Black and brown communities. And so we have a visual that isn't necessarily, for those of us who are engaged in the work in these spaces, we understand how racialized it is, but now we have it on the evening news. We have images, we have stories about workers, we have it in the newspapers, we have it on social media, right? So we're being bombarded with these images of those who are continuing to run Instacart and bring us food and are continuing to work in the restaurants to make sure that we're actually still able, that people are able to order food and working in the grocery stores. So we see all of these things. And so indeed, this development of this term created a new narrative frame for understanding the significance of the work and most importantly, the vulnerability of the workers. And so this emergence of an essential worker narrative provided an opportunity to kind of forcibly shift perhaps some of the negative tropes that are often associated and that adhere to low-wage workers, work and workers. So what's interesting about, and at the time that all of this was happening, I had a little bit of excitement, okay, so now maybe that we are actually seeing, the narrative seems to be shifting, and we're now talking about workers as a country, we're talking about workers that we don't typically discuss. Perhaps that will lead to a change in policy because we're seeing a change in some of the narrative. Unfortunately, what we ultimately saw was the exploitation and subordination of essential workers during that time period, the continued exploitation. For example, in the meatpacking industry, where over half of workers are people of color or immigrants, workers found that workplace laws provided little protection during the height of the pandemic. The OSHA, which provides workplace protection, did little to intervene to protect workers in the meatpacking industry ultimately. And 87% of people of color in meat processing contracted COVID-19, right? So the pandemic also increased the vulnerability of workers already susceptible to violations of our wage and hour statutes. So in Los Angeles, for example, a survey of 400 fast food workers found that a quarter had reported contracting COVID-19 and nearly 2/3 reported experiencing wage theft during the pandemic. And so we have this structural racism and racialization that is, I think, contributing to the vulnerability of Black and brown workers who are at real risk of exploitation during the pandemic, despite what was kind of an opportunity to change the narrative about how we think about those spaces. And despite this heightened focus, ultimately, while there were some changes, some policy changes in different places that were a little bit broader and more inclusive of workers and certain immigrant workers and Latinx workers, most of those were temporary. Very, very little was made permanent. And so there weren't really any permanent changes in our laws as a result of the heightened visibility of Latinx workers and low-wage workers and these essential workers. So that's I think the grounding and the background of this conversation. I will say that I think that a lot of this, as we think about how do we change policy, is grounded in the reality of a racial capitalism framework and the reality that racialization of the production of capital in the United States is part of its founding, and it is how the country operates, and that the importance of capitalism and how that machine keeps running and its dependence on exploitation, largely of Black and brown workers, has I think meant that it's very difficult to change the narratives because there isn't really the same type of push to do that because this exploitation becomes necessary for capitalism to exist. And so it makes it very challenging for us to change the policies. And for those of you who I know are working full time in these spaces, I see nods and yes, it is very hard to move this needle. But I think I'll end it, my initial comments at least there, and of course my wonderful co-panelists may have things to add to that conversation.
Thank you for that. And we talked about sometimes like the COVID pandemic is a thing of the past, but it's still here. We still have COVID-19, and we still have to figure out how to continue to protect, educate, and figure out what are policies that workers need to stay healthy. So the next question that I have is, what was the experience of Latina workers during the COVID-19 pandemic? This is for Stacy Villalobos. And what support or lack thereof they had in receiving compensation, PPE, worker protections, childcare, or in their needs, the impact that they suffer.
Can you all hear me? No?
No.
Okay. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the pandemic took an immense personal and financial toll on Latina workers, and I come to this work as a practicing lawyer. I work at Legal Aid at Work, which is a San Francisco-based nonprofit that works across California, and we focus on workers' rights and economic justice issues, and we do that through kind of traditional legal aid, but also impact litigation, policy advocacy, and community education. And so my clients, prior to the pandemic, were already all struggling. They were all living paycheck to paycheck, really having limited healthcare access, struggling to pay for those basic needs. And COVID just made it worse and compounded some of those inequities that were already baked into the system. And I love the framing that you brought for us, Professor Green, around this racial capitalism model, right? Because oftentimes people talk about my clients as low-wage workers, right? Low-skill workers, but I like to talk about them as economically exploited workers, right? Because that's what they are. It's a choice that we're making to pay these folks who bring these really valuable services, who are bringing these immense contributions to our economy, to our communities. It's a choice to economically exploit them and make it so that someone else, right, is getting the fruits of their labor. And so I want to focus on just one measure of that impact, of the negative impact that the pandemic had on Latina workers, and that's lost jobs. And then we'll turn to the support piece of the question. So by April 2020, Latinas had the very dubious distinction, right, of having the highest unemployment rate among all workers. 20%, 1 in 5 Latina workers were unemployed, lost their jobs in some way because of the pandemic. And to give you a sense of the absolute number of people that affected in just one industry, I'll share this, that in the span of 2 months from March to May 2020, 700,000 Latinas in the leisure and hospitality industries lost their jobs. And that's thanks to some wonderful LPPI research, by the way, so I want to give a shout out to them. On the support side, Latinas received really limited, but honestly, sadly, historic, in some ways at least, support, at least at the height of the pandemic, right? As you know, we're still in the middle of the pandemic right now. So there was action by the federal government in the form of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which gave us up to 10 days of paid sick leave to workers affected by the virus or to caregive, right, for family members. There was the CARES Act, which provided extensions to unemployment insurance and stimulus payments. There were other stimulus payments by the federal government. At the state level, we had California's sick leave expansion for workers excluded from the federal laws. And so there were these actions that were taken that were in some ways historic, but I want to be very clear that this fell short, right? The historic is more a reflection of how paltry support for economically exploited workers has been in the past, rather than a testament to how significant or substantive, right, the support was. It was not enough, and it left a lot of people out. And I will say, we'll talk a little bit more about who it left out in later questions, but structural racism and sexism and occupational segregation were really at the base of a lot of those exclusions. And one clear example that I want to note, just because it's still ongoing, is SB 686 in its latest iteration, which is a bill that would have ended the unjust and racist exclusion of domestic workers from our workplace health and safety laws. So even, right, we have OSHA, which isn't doing its job for our people, but even for domestic workers, there is no OSHA. There is no even right to have OSHA intervene. And the domestic worker movement has been bringing for several years now a bill to try to end that exclusion. And just this past year, that was vetoed by Governor Newsom in his latest iteration, which is SB 686. And as Llezlie noted too, as Professor Green noted, it was also temporary, right? So a lot of those protections, the Families First Coronavirus Act, I had to go back and look up how many days it was, because it's not relevant anymore to my clients, right? I was like, how many days was that? Oh, right, it was 10, right? That's no longer in effect. And so my clients aren't actually getting the benefit of those laws anymore, because it was all temporary in this very unique moment where we're now all moving on and pretending that the pandemic isn't continuing, that people aren't continuing to need paid sick leave, even though people are continuing to get COVID now. And just one final note that I'll say is that it's really important to note that Latinas are not a monolith. You made reference to this at the beginning, right? That we've had really different experiences in different sectors, at different geographic regions, racially, with different immigration statuses, at different ages, at different incomes. And one just important thing I want to know, one important difference I want to note, just to close on a kind of happier note, is the impact of a union. So unionized Latina workers were 7 times less likely to experience job loss than non-unionized Latina workers. So being a part of a union really shielded folks from the more severe economic instability during the workforce. And I'm happy to say I'm part of a union, and that's just another good reason to unionize your workplace if you're not already unionized. And so that'll turn it back.
That's a good lead to my next question for Lorena. I mean, during the labor movement,
Yes.
you've been part of this, of trying to figure out what's the role of the labor movement in advocating for protections for workers. What role does documentation or immigration status plays into how Latinas were affected and engaged in the process of organizing and seeking protection? And what specific legal needs undocumented workers have, including seniors, young DACA recipients,
Right.
and how can they be addressed, and what is the role that and the movement is playing to try to figure out how to engage those workers?
First, thank you for inviting me. It's really great for this law students, UCLA law students. How many do we have in here? I know there's a couple. Well, maybe one. Anyway, as a UCLA law grad, it's good to see you all so involved in this. I don't think I had the wherewithal when I was in law school to even be this forward thinking. So it's just great to be back on campus. I do want to start. It's funny that we ended with unionizing, because that's what I do. So for those who don't know, the California Labor Federation is the umbrella group for all of the unions in California. We are the largest federation next to the AFL-CIO National in the United States. So we have like 1,300 local unions that are part of our umbrella group. We represent over 2.2 million workers, from everything from janitors to teachers to firefighters to pilots. If they're unionized, they're part of us. Public employees, private employees, construction trades. And so it's a wide breadth of workers. And I'll just say everything that was said about joining a union is true. That is the best protection we can ever give to a Latina, is let her empower herself through a union. But I do want to point out something that is essential for us to frame ourselves around. And it's something that gets too little attention. And it's hard to say, because as Latinas in particular, we tend to, and this is a generalization, but we're caregivers, right? We're worrying about other people a lot. The reality is, going into the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, Latinas are the subgroup that is the lowest paid. They have the highest pay inequities. They have the lowest representation in just about every field. And we're not just saying, compared to white women, or we're lower than, our pay inequities is lower than Black women, we're lower than Native American women, we're lower than Asian women. The disparity has always been huge, and for those people who want to say it's just a low wage issue, it's not. Because when you look at surgeons in the United States, Latina surgeons make 46 cents on the dollar of their male counterparts. Something else is going on when Latinas are that disregarded in a field that is highly educated, highly qualified, highly valued. And so we had to look at that, right? What happened even going into the pandemic that we were in a position? It doesn't matter if you're documented or if you're undocumented. All of these things just become worse when you don't have documentation, or when you have some other vulnerabilities, or you're in a mixed status family. But they exist on every single level. And I think that's really important. When I was in the legislature, we started an Unseen Latina project. In fact, a lot of this came out of that, because we said hey, we can't just keep lifting up other folks. Nobody's going to look out for us. And we do actually have to. We have a responsibility. I always say to our mothers, to our tias, to our daughters, to say like, hey, something's going wrong here with Latinas. What is it and how can we change this? And I don't want to suggest, I worked very hard in the legislature at trying to normalize the work of farm workers. Most people don't realize that farm workers today are about 50% female. It's often thought of as a male profession. It is not. But because it's often thought of as a male profession, I actually think it was easier to normalize the laws regarding farm workers when it came to overtime, when it came to the right to organize, than it has been on domestic workers that everybody knows are Latina, because somehow that seems like less important. And until we actually can get the same rights for domestic workers as every other worker, we will never get rid of the vestiges of slavery. Both farm work and housework, if you will, domestic work, are vestiges of slavery. And the reason we don't respect workers is because people originally, the fights were actually waged in Congress. They were African Americans should not have the same rights as white folks. That's what they said in the 1930s when they were arguing these questions about farm workers and domestic workers. Slowly, those African Americans, or the jobs held by them, became held by immigrants, the newest immigrant. We continue to see that. And what we have left, at least in California, in other states, they haven't fixed the farm worker issue. And I'm not going to say we fixed it. Under the law, we have equality. In practice, we have a lot of way to go. But we have not fixed in California, even as progressive as we are, or even come close to fixing the domestic worker issue. And that's something that we really have to look at, because when you're talking about undocumented workers and undocumented Latinas, a lot of them are in the care economy, in the domestic economy, basically, that becomes the issue. Even before the pandemic, don't forget, domestic workers, we had to run a bill to say when there are big fires, when people are abandoning their houses, they can't force their workers to come in and water the lawn so that their house doesn't burn. That they cannot penalize or have them come take care of their dogs or come help, when everybody else is being evacuated. And that actually happened in Los Angeles. And so these are the things that were happening even prior to the pandemic, when all of a sudden everything was exasperated more. Another feature in the pandemic, whether documented or undocumented, but it hit undocumented more, where if you were a Latina mother, 50% of Latina mothers either had to leave the workforce or drastically reduce their hours in order to provide childcare. Childcare is an issue, and it continues to be an issue. One of the things we've done in California is we're really trying to give childcare workers the right to unionize. We actually have a law now, trying to organize them, yes, childcare workers, I know, this is slow growing. It's like our home health care workers. We will eventually get there. They are not paid what they need to be paid. They're disproportionately Latina. And so we need to continue to lift up the work of childcare as well as availability of childcare. When Latinas are undocumented, another issue that they really face, and it becomes an issue, especially mixed status households, but it is the fear of deportation, being able to leave abusive situations, being able to, if you're unemployed, access unemployment insurance. If you're on your own, you're a single mom, even if your child has certain protections, the mother so often does not. That has been a continued problem. But where are unions getting it right? We know that with the protection of a union contract, that Latinas, undocumented, documented, do much better. And we see it every day in the janitorial field, we see it in the home health care field, we see it in the hospitality industry. There are protections that are given. But this administration, I could say a lot of mixed things about the presidential administration, but I want to point this out. One of the things that they gave us is something called deferred action. And it is something that we're trying to utilize, and we're trying to train organizers and workers throughout the state, in California to utilize, but nationally could utilize. And that is that you have protection from deportation if you have a labor violation, if you report a labor violation, which means in organizing campaigns that for so long, our vulnerable workers, our workers that could be deported, if their employer knows that they're unionizing, can now be subject to this protection. We've been utilizing it. Thank God we have the head, an acting secretary of labor who totally understands this. Of course, she, did most of her work here in California with undocumented or mixed status families in the garment industry, but she understands it so well and has been able to protect us to help push that as an idea. And then we have a labor commissioner, of course, as well in California, who has utilized this and is giving blanket, basically deferred action protection to workers. It's not a permanent solution, right? It runs out. We know this. Like DACA, it's not a permanent solution. We have to continue to fight, and we will continue to fight for immigration reform. But in the meantime, being able to utilize laws that protect workers who organize is essential.
Your ideas and your talk made me think about one of the realities about Latina women and coming back into the workforce. I mean, we heard that 1 in 5 Latinas lost their job during the pandemic. But coming back, there's research that says that we are back in full force in the economy. We have the lowest unemployment rate, and there's 1 more billion Latinas in the workforce right now. And I want to ask this question of Professor Green, to perhaps frame the reason for that. Another, in that same study, and you can read this as an article, I can share it, it's in a magazine, the 19th, it talks about the new economic data coming about women of color returning to the workforce in mass right now. Black women and Latina women spend 34% more time than white women taking care of family members, that whether it be children and elder care, because we live in multi-generational households in which we do take care of both children and elder relatives. And we spend less time in paid work, right? Because that forces us to have less of a formal employment that impacts our long-term economic stability. So why is this? We in this country don't have policies to address the issue of unpaid work for women across the board, but this is an issue for women of color. Why is this so worrisome? It should be worrisome for the long-term economic prosperity of Latinas or Black women and women of color. The fact that we do spend a big amount of time doing unpaid care work, and even the women who do paid work also are lower paid.
I have two. I think that it's so critically important for Latino women, for women of color more broadly, because it is true, right? You're talking about these multi-generational households and the reality of a lack of generational wealth, right? I don't live in a multi-generational household, but I am taking care of another household, right? In addition to my child in my household, right? So that is like a real, I think it's a very clear reality for so many women of color that I know, and certainly, like you said, in Latina households, which are more likely to be also multi-generational, you are talking about a substantial amount of caregiving, and there are only so many hours in the day, right? I think that part of what makes all of this more challenging is, very intersectional and gendered in so many ways, because we have so few protections. We don't really have many. Like our labor laws and our employment laws, if you were to compare them internationally to other developed countries, if you were to compare them in Europe, we really don't protect workers very well, right? Unless you have a union. One of the things I've taught employment and labor law, and the students come out of it kind of understanding that whenever I pose a problem, the question is, the first question you have to ask is, is it an organized workplace, right? Then there may be some rights. If they're not, then it gets sketchy very quickly in terms of what you can really do. We tend to only think about our workplace laws. We often think about them in terms of Title VII, which are the anti-discrimination laws in the workplace, but there are so many other laws that are regulating what's happening in the workplace, including the Fair Labor Standards Act and the multitude of state corollaries, including, what's interesting about, being in California and talking about this is that, and I'm in DC, which actually has pretty good wage and hour and employment laws as well, and California certainly has the most progressive and the most protective laws for workers, and that you still see wage theft. We're still seeing economic precarity. We still see all of those things happen despite the existence, at least on the books, right, of all of these laws. But at the end of the day, because we also don't have, as a country, safety nets in place, right? We are able to generate safety for our families. And by safety, I mean like economic safety, like healthcare, all of those things come out of our jobs in the United States. They're not things that are necessarily provided to the population by the government, right? So there is certain a sense or a difference if you were to compare this to places in Europe, for example, where the inability to maximize your economic pay in the workforce really impacts, can your kids go to college in a way that if you're in Europe, it's not, you don't have the same kind of concerns. Your healthcare is covered differently and you're like all of these other issues. So it's not, I think the challenge is we are in a country in which there is no, like our bottom is really low. Like how far we're willing to let things go for people is so much lower than it is in other countries. And so if we think about I'm explaining versus justifying, right? Like I don't think it's right, but the reality is that we live in a country that employs capitalism and racial capitalism, and as a result, all of our security is connected to our earning.
Yeah.
Right, or so much of it, and certainly for those of us who don't have generational wealth, it's connected to earning. So if you have Latino workers who are not in the position to earn in the same ways and are being underpaid in substantial ways, then you're talking about a threat to so much of the security of the community, because all of that is connected to what we earn in jobs, rightly or not rightly, wrongly, but like that's the reality of the world in which we live.
And this leads me to the question, and I'll do this last round before I take questions from the audience, of if we have a segregated labor market based on racial capitalism that creates different rights for different type of workers, what type of, as policymakers and as students of policy and lawyers, what are some of the policy solutions that we ought to be focusing on that addresses some of these, implicit and explicit discriminatory practices of a labor market? So I know we can have a list, but I wanted to just maybe ask either one of you as advocates to sort of frame if we had the magic wand about what to do to alleviate some of this market segregation that our laws are having in place, like what should we focus on as activists and as students of labor policy to advance?
Well, I think it's clear that, I think you're right, California has the most progressive laws when it comes to these issues, but we have a huge problem with enforcement, and it's one of the biggest problems that we continue to talk about. It doesn't matter how many laws we pass. By the way, I passed 80 of them when I was in almost all geared at Latinas or workers or women, and even one that made wage theft a crime. You could go to jail. It's been used once. So we're pushing for the enforcement of these great laws. But what she said was also right. Like our laws, even the best of them in California, are so substandard to other countries. It's almost embarrassing that we can be proud of what we've done here in California. So the policy changes that need to happen. Number one, at the national level, we got to have better labor law protections. We have to have anti-retaliation for organizing. We have to make it easier for people to join unions. We have to have immigration reform. Those are national things. Those have to happen nationally. And so those two things together, or even one by one, could substantially help Latinas in the workplace. On a state level, we've done a little bit, but it is such a battle to get this governor to understand the needs of Latinas. For example, we did have the COVID protections for 10 days, and then those went away. California was the first state in the nation to pass paid sick laws for every single worker in our state. 3 days. Not nearly enough. This year, Senator Lorena Gonzalez carried our bill, the Labor Fed's bill, to extend that to 5 days. We only got 5 days, 5 years after we got 3 days, because of COVID, because they were like, I guess employers could do 10 days, they can probably do 5 days, right? Paid family leave, we talk about caring for children and parents. We have paid family leave in California, most states don't. However, we only provide a certain percentage of your income. So if you are the lowest paid worker and you're getting 60% of if you're a minimum wage worker, you're expected to live, when you're taking that leave, on 60% of your pay. That's inherently harder for Latinas than it would be, because we're in lower paid jobs often more than other folks. So these policies we pass and we continue to promote, And that was a battle. I'm going to be really honest. So if you look historically at how that came about, when we were in the legislature, the governor came in, and God bless this governor, he says a lot of great things. He's like, I want to extend paid family leave. We're going to have it be 12 weeks now. And everybody's like, go 12 weeks. And we started saying like, well, wait a minute, Latinas aren't even taking it because you're only paying them at that time 55% of their salary. So what does it matter? You're extending it for women who work at Gap, because Gap, they actually came in, were so proud of themselves. They pay the rest of it, right? Not Gap in the store, Gap corporate, of course. You know, that's great. Who do you think is benefiting from that? Actually, the company is, because they're already providing it. But when you talk about Latinas, does that actually, are there many Latinas that could actually go out for, additional weeks? No, not if you're not getting income replacement. So we fought the administration, the Latina caucus in particular, and a bunch of us Latinas on income replacement. We finally got some increases in it, but it's still not where it needs to be. So if we pass bills, but they still disproportionately don't fulfill the needs of Latinas, we're not going to get anywhere. We're still going to have that gap. The amazing thing in California is all the laws too that we've done on stopping the pay gap between men and women. They've actually been successful, right? We see the pay gap decreasing. That's because they've been very successful for white women. Meanwhile, Latinas in California make 42 cents on the dollar of their white male counterpart, right? California is worse for Latinas than any other state in the nation. How is that? How do we have the best laws in the country? How are we actually reducing the pay gap, and yet it's not going anywhere for us? What else is going on? And one last policy. I'm sorry, I can all like, that's the end. All right. And so, and the last one is we did, we're a constant, I don't mean to put down the governor, he's better than most. We're in this constant fight in a racial capitalist society. He's okay. But we're constantly in this fight because one of the protections we got during COVID that we were really proud of is recall and retention rights for hotel workers. Yes. So we knew that all these hotel workers, as was stated, got laid off massively, especially here in LA, right? And then what happened was, as they were opening up, the hotels were trying to just bring back the cheapest, youngest worker, or go outside of their previous workforce and hire other folks. This affected especially, I don't want to say older, but your 40, 50, 60-year-old Latina housekeeper the most. So we created a law that said that they had to do recall by seniority. It was very hard to get. It took us a year and a half. We pushed extremely hard. Local 11 here, United Here Local 11 was a phenomenal organizing around it. And we've gotten so much money in the hands of hotel workers that the hotels violated that. But that's because it was like a fight. Well, we went back to them and we said, can we extend this for good? Because we know tourism goes up and down, right? We know that that's an issue constantly, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a weather-related crisis, whatever it is. Well, no. You can have it if it's presumed to be because of COVID. That's what we got this year. Okay. So there are things out there. We know they work. We want them to work, but we've got to continue to push for them. Sorry, that was way too much.
No, we can hear you, listen to your stories, I think, because there's so much that you're done on this issue. So, but we've got to keep the conversation going. But thinking about that, earlier there was a comment on the stage that said we need more lawyers. I would say we need more organizers and more activists as well. Because part of what you're talking about is having the ability to organize for change. And then having legislators who are Latinas and come from our communities actually pushing for those things. So we need more legislators as well, pushing for those issues. But thinking about how hard it is to change our laws, and even when we change them, the system is so rigged for those who don't have the power not to for our community. What else could we be doing in terms of advancing key reforms or engaging more policymakers to actually, push for some fundamental change?
Yeah, and this is a question that I think about a lot, and really what does a fair economy look like? Within the framework of this racial capitalism, right? There's my ideal world, overthrow everything, but then there's incremental policy change side. Stacy that I think about, and I really do think it goes back to organizers. So at Legal Aid at Work, actually, I was lucky enough to bring on and to get sort of the okay from my management to hire the first organizer to work at Legal Aid at Work, and we just made her permanent thanks to some grant funding, and we just made her permanent the end of this past year. So now she'll officially be a part of Legal Aid at Work for hopefully forever. And so I really do think that that is a key part of it, right? Like, lawyers aren't trained to build power, right? We're trained to work within the halls of power. We're trained to sometimes cater to power, right? But we're not trained to build power. And so it's amazing, even in, we're doing the same type of work. We're still litigating, we're still bringing these big cases, we're doing direct services, we're doing policy advocacy, right? But the ways in which we do that has really shifted now that I've been working with this organizer, right? And it's not just about getting the bill passed, right? It's about more than that. Because then once the bill is passed, right, to the conversation we were having earlier, who's going to make sure that that bill gets respected, right? And one of the formative experiences that I had as a young lawyer, or actually I was as an undergrad, I'll say, was working with the domestic workers' rights movement, which I think is just really one of the examples that I hold up, and it's really personal to me because my mom's a domestic worker, actually. And I remember speaking to this domestic worker. We were collecting stories that were later going to be used to advocate for the domestic worker bill of rights. And she was telling me about how, she learned that she had this right, and then she told her employer that her employer had to respect it. And I was like, even as, I was a Stanford undergrad at the point, I've always been kind of like a shy kid, and so I was like, wow, I don't know if I would have had the balls, basically, right? Like the courage to tell my employer, no, you have to respect this right? And so I really think activating not just the policymakers, not just the people at the top, but really the people who are most directly impacted by this is what that looks like. And so I have my laundry list of policy wishes, like fair scheduling, a living wage, right? Not just a minimum wage, but actually a living wage, unionization and just cause protections for everyone, a robust safety net and anti-poverty programs, right? Maybe that looks like a universal basic income, maybe that looks like something else. So I have that laundry list of things, but I think it's more about kind of the process and the how do we transform how we advocate for these policies rather than just what we're advocating for, and making sure that that's really people-driven and directly impacted people-driven, and that it transforms them in the process of advocating for that, as well as ourselves.
Awesome. We're going to have time for a couple of questions from the audience, but I wanted to post this last one while you all think about your questions and you raise your hand. I wanted to just get a quick reaction from Professor Green or any one of you. There's been this talk about how American workers or women are part of the great resignation or the great quit or the great reshuffling of priorities, and employers talking about how hard it is to get young people back to work or people back to work. Yet at the same time, in our community, people have to work. So what is happening? But they're still making demand. There's a lot of demands happening from workers, and we can see it in all the organizing that is happening. So what would you call, if there was a word that we could call it for what's happening to low-wage workers and women of color in the reshuffling of the economy?
I don't know if I have a word, but it does strike me that as much as this new essential worker narrative didn't result in immediate change to federal policy, we have, of course, seen since the pandemic substantial increases in efforts to unionize. The organizing has moved forward. And so I do think that perhaps the one benefit of the essential worker narrative is maybe for the workers themselves, right? To see, and also to the level of exploitation becomes so extreme that it pushes people, right, to be in a position in which they feel as though they really have to speak about it. So perhaps the benefit of the essential worker narrative, while it didn't have an immediate legal policy shift, is it did maybe perhaps shift the thought process and the activism and the demands of the working people. I do think that part of the challenge and part of the problem is that there are so many who now realize how hard they're working for so little and are therefore demanding more. And that's certainly, I think generations have always tried to demand that. The current younger generation is very adamant about that and about this idea that we need to figure out how we're going to raise this bar a bit, right? That we need to have some minimum that is better than what's been in place, and they've been willing to fight for that. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing. I know that was not a word to describe it, but that's the best I can do, I think.
Lorena, do you feel hopeful that we can shift the balance of power and get some power for workers?
I mean, I wouldn't be still doing this work if I didn't feel hopeful. I think I have to feel hopeful. I have a 27-year-old daughter who's half Latina, half Black, and if I can't change the shit for her, I don't, maybe her daughter in the future. But it takes a lot. I have to be honest, and I, for so long, was like one of the young people in the room, and I realize now I'm becoming one of the older people in the room. But yeah, it was really hard to be a legislator. No, I was the man. But I have to say, I am so inspired by this room and all of these rooms that I get into and see so many young Latinas, and to even be on this panel, like Stanford grads, UCLA Law, like these Latinas who are coming in, who are being educated, whether you're going to be an organizer, you're going to be a labor leader, or a legislator, or a lawyer, or an academic, and using that to lift up the rest of our community, not turning your back, not going and being part of, there are plenty of folks who do that shit too, but you're not looking for capitalizing necessarily off of this racist capitalism. You're looking to change things, and that's what makes me feel hopeful, because these rooms didn't look like this when I was your age, some of you, and I can imagine people older than me that would really say that, right? And so there might have been 2 or 3 of us, and so it's inspiring, and it makes me feel like we can do this.
And we were talking about what we need more of. What I will say from the academy's perspective is we need more Latinas in the academy. Like, it is a real challenge at so many institutions. There are so few just Latinx faculty just generally in law schools. The numbers are lower than they should be.
I'll say I had one Latina professor in law school. I had never had a Latina professor before that, or even teacher. Growing up in San Diego, I never had a Latina. Laura Gomez here, and I guess she's not even at UCLA anymore, so there's back to being 0 Latina professors at UCLA Law.
We do need more Latinas in the academia, doing the research and putting our experiences in how we analyze the data that is out there. Yeah, centering voices and finding solutions for our problem. You want to comment on the question? Okay. Okay, this is a good question. I think it continues. What can a recent college graduate, attorney, or a current law student can do to advocate best for Latina workers' rights and issues at work? Maybe you can address that.
Well, I'm going to go back to first, unionize your workplace, right? The personal is political. There is a fight. Not only, you can write letters to your legislator, you can get plugged into some of these movements. There are all those things that you can do in your personal and professional life, but also think about, I am a worker. You are a worker, right? And you are a Latina worker, most of you, right, in this room. And so thinking about, how can I then adopt that, thinking about that identity, and then thinking about how do I create power in my own workplace would be my number one. And that I have to say as a workers' rights advocate, right? But beyond that, I think too, getting plugged into all these different organizations that are doing this amazing work, right? I think if you look at the bios for this entire conference, right? Looking at all those listed organizations and thinking about, okay, do I see myself plugging in at this organization or that organization, right? And getting plugged in with these movements, right, I think is the really key part for me. And I think this is something that I think more and more now we're talking about in law schools, right, about movement-based lawyering, and what does that look like, and how do we actually change the way that we've done lawyering, not to look like, the lawyering of yesteryear, where it was mostly a different group of folks doing lawyering, right, but the lawyering of tomorrow, right, and so I would say that would be where I would start.
Another question that came, that's here, I think is related to an earlier comment that both of you made about how the pay gap is still, it's very obvious that even though for Latinas who are highly educated or in the professional field, we still earn 52% in comparison to a white male. So that's still have a pay gap. The question here says, how did COVID-19 and the pandemic impact other occupations like healthcare or Latinas in education? How did that impact the ability to make progress on those fields? And what can we do about it?
So one of the things that I think was really challenging, right, about COVID-19 across the board for all jobs, people who came out of there was certainly an exodus out of the workforce because we were taking care of our families, or for even of those who were still working. I mean, my child was, I live in Washington, D.C. My child was out of school that entire year. So I was working 2 full-time, so I was like working, continuing to teach at the law school, but also having a 6th grader in my house, trying to get her through school, right? I was able to maintain my job, but was I able to write, which is part of what I'm supposed to be doing? Absolutely not, right? And it's a personal example, a personal narrative about like what were the limitations that were created by the fact that I was engaging in caregiving, right? What we actually found, even in the academic space, for example, is that men wrote more during the pandemic, right? Because they were home, or we were at home, and they may have had more time where we didn't have as much service or other things required of us. They were home, but they weren't the ones at home taking care of the kids. So the women who were, who were juggling it actually struggled and needed more time to work, to write. And this is, a generalization. I certainly don't mean every single man, every single male academic, but like that's what the data shows, that they were actually more productive, right? So if we think about that, like how we know that extrapolates across all of the different jobs, right? The reality is that for those who were in positions where you could work from home, what that meant for women versus what it meant for men who were home and some perhaps more productive, right? We're like, oh, this is great. And men are like, this is not, in fact, great.
Another question that we didn't really touch, and maybe Lorena, you can address it. It says all age security is connected to earnings during your working life, and yes, Latina women are earning less and have less economic security in our working days. How are we aging economically, and how we can secure that exploited workers today have safe retirement, that identified retirement? How do we address that?
And then add on top of that, undocumented workers that sometimes, even if they're paying into Social Security, I think about my own father, 40 years paying into Social Security under somebody else's Social Security number, you're not getting that back. It's a problem. One of the things I think that we're most proud of and what we fight hardest for, and a lot of people don't realize, is even in our lowest wage work, union work, whether it's the farm worker or the unionized hotel worker, the janitor, there's a little bit that goes into a defined benefit, pension or a 401k, additional help. And that's another reason why we have to continue to have unions. When I was in the legislature, and I support everything to raise the minimum wage, right? Every single time. I'm for that. I caution people, though, when we continue to raise the minimum wage and we don't talk about some of the other features that you would have in a union contract that you cannot really regulate in legislation, right? And that is a secure retirement. While, in the early 2000s, we had people attacking pensions, luckily some of our unions held on to their pensions, and that will be another source of income for aging Latinas who had a union contract, and that's one of the reasons it's so important. But for those who don't, and for those who are the most vulnerable, it often means that you're working until you die, right? And that's a reality, or until your kids can take care of you, because we are living that multi-generational. My answer to everything is unionize more workplaces, secure good contracts, bargain for good contracts. That includes ensuring that when there's a strike, you never cross the picket line, you support striking workers, because they're making sure that those protections are in there for the future.
And here's the reality around this whole, because I think I have family members who are like, I'm going to work till I die, and then now they're at an age where they can't work. It's like, that's not actually a real, right? On some level, because we're all living longer. Yeah. This whole I'll work till I die. Like, you're not going to work till you're not. People are living into their 80s and 90s regularly now. So like that actually is not
that's true.
A thing in the same way. And you have this cycle, right? Because then you have the problem of people who thought they would work till they died can't, and now you have them back at home with their kids who are now what we were just talking about, the most general, this cycle in which the particularly women aren't able to work and invest in their careers in the same way, and their economic viability, because now they're also taking care of these parents who assumed that they would work until they died.
So we could keep sharing our experiences and talking about how we can solve segregated workplaces and gender dynamics in the workplace and racial capitalism. But I think that we're running out of time. We have 1 minute left. Any one last question for any of the panelists? Or something that you're dying to ask before we close? That's the last one.
Hi there, my name is Llezlie Green. I am an attorney from El Salvador, and I came to the U.S. 5 years ago, and now I work in public policy. And one of the reasons that I chose this path is because in El Salvador, and I really like what you said, of like, we are not really trained to do power, but just to work within the walls within halls of power, and I was just stunned with that. And so I wanted to make change, but one of the biggest, I would say, challenge that I found myself is that in El Salvador, I could be, the best lawyer in the world, if you want to call it, but here, no. And so there's no real pathway on how to, if you want to continue on that career and that path, how do you do that here, right? And so I'm just thinking about many other professions like doctors, academics that are probably in the same situation, but there's no real pipeline for immigrants to make sure that we help into that shortage of Latino professionals. And so I think that there's a need for reform, but I haven't even been, heard or included in those conversations.
Stacy, if you want to.
I think maybe too you're referring to sort of like the limitations around immigrants who come here with professional certifications with their degrees, but then aren't able to necessarily practice right away. So that happens in the nursing and medical professions a lot. I see that a lot. That happens in the legal profession, right? And so folks who are doctors in their home countries, right, come to the United States and they're like the janitors, right, in the hospitals, or folks who are lawyers. It sounds like this is also affecting you personally, right, as a lawyer in El Salvador. You come here and then you're not able to unless you take the bar and fulfill all the requirements related to that, right? And so there have been efforts to reform occupational licensing. I'm actually more familiar with those efforts related to giving folks with conviction records actually access to occupational licenses. So but again, I think it's the same kinds of answers, right? Like bringing this, like activating the communities who are affected by this, and then bringing this, building power within those communities, and then forcing, right, those policymakers, forcing those halls of power to actually listen and to affect change so that your amazing skills and your amazing experiences and everything else can actually benefit our entire community.
And I think that you being here is part of creating a community, a network support, find a mentor, find someone who has gone through the same process and has been able to get the occupational licenses so you can restart your career. But part of coming to a symposium like that for Latinas and by Latinas is part of creating your network so that you figure out how to strengthen your ability to exercise your craft, because that's what we're all doing. So
so many of us too who are attorneys. I guess still feel like a nobody, but I literally, like, my father came here as an undocumented farm worker. My mom raised me as a single mom. She was a nurse. When I went to Stanford, I didn't even know how to talk to a professor. Even all the way through when I got a law degree, I was a single mom. I had a baby. I was like, in a lot of ways, we also were nothing starting out. So I don't want you to feel discouraged, because there is opportunity and it is finding that community. But I know it must feel that way for you, but it also feels that way for all of it. Many of us who grew up with no privilege whatsoever, knew nobody, didn't know how to navigate the system. First in my family to go to college, scared to talk to a professor, like you name it, that was me. And we can do it.
Yes,
you can do it. You already know what you are. So
thank you so much for coming to this discussion. I'm here for the next 2 days. We can have coffee on the side and talk more about Latinas in the workplace and all the research that is out there. And first of all, do the research, become a lawyer, but also become an organizer and become an activist in your community so we can change this reality. Thank you so much, and I'll see you out there.